Multi-hazards, all about protecting communities.
Hi everybody, again we're here for another episode of the Multi-Hazards podcast, where we take a deep dive into issues of emergency management, climate change adaptation, security, etc. And at the end of it all, our goal is protection, protecting communities. So welcome. I'm Vin Nelson, the host of Multi-Hazards. Today, we have the honor of talking with Paul Edmonds. He is principal and founder of Red Dragon Consulting, which does emergency management and resilience consultancy services out of British Columbia, BC, Canada. He settled in BC in 2018 from a successful United Kingdom, UK career. He has appreciation and gratitude to call the Okanagan his new home and acknowledges he works within First Nation territories who have inalienable Aboriginal title and rights. His first role in BC was managing the Okanagan Similkameen floods, landslides, and wildfires of 2018. He went on to provide subject matter expert advice for the boundary flood recovery in Kootenay boundary and Grand Forks areas. In BC, Paul now assists many different governments and organizations in many different roles. Red Dragon has delivered advanced planning, response planning, flood response planning, wildfire communications, operational response procedures, gap analysis, and evacuation plans. Paul and his organization deal with the following: mitigation strategies and risk assessments, grant writing, including assisting on a major disaster mitigation and adaptation fund, DMAF, Emergency Operations Center, EOC design and exercises, industrial risks, mentoring, recommending measures to protect cultural heritage. He has taken part in local and provincial workshops in shaping the future. Paul also works with a number of qualified professionals to deliver resiliency and mitigation projects, to name a few. So, as Red Dragon's principal consultant and founder, Paul Edmonds is a provincially qualified supplier of emergency management. So that's his bio. And now it's my custom here at the Multi-Hazards podcast, due to deep respect for the First Nations people on whose land I podcast, here in the suburbs of Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, to say a territorial acknowledgement. So the text I always use is from Kwantlen Polytechnic University, or KPU, which is just a few kilometers from my home. So here we go. We work, study, and live in a region south of the Fraser River, which overlaps with the unceded traditional and ancestral lands of the Kwantlen, Musqueam, Katzie, Semiahmoo, Tsawwassen, Kikite, and Quiquetlam peoples. These are the names of various First Nations groups around me here in Greater Vancouver, here on the west coast of Canada. Now, without further ado, let's get to the interview. Welcome, listeners, to the Multi-Hazards podcast. And today is a really special day because I have been seeking out emergency managers, and they're all too busy with COVID-19 and wildfires and floods and whatever else they're doing, exercises, drills. And Paul Edmonds has been so gracious to come on the podcast. Not that he's not busy. I mean, he's super busy, but he's made the time. So welcome, Paul. I'm so happy to have you here today.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Vin. I think it's a pleasure to talk to you finally, and we've done quite a few rain checks of actually getting this off the ground, haven't we?
Yeah, and I guess maybe later this summer you're going to also be super busy again. So this is the chance. Now, I'm just wondering, how are you doing with these crazy last few months of COVID-19 pandemic and trying to work and trying to accomplish everything at the same time?
It's certainly been an interesting time, let's say that. Around about November last year, I slowed down for about a week And ever since then, I've just ramped up and up with work for different clients, First Nations, local governments, and ministries, including going to help set up COVID-19 response structures, as well as doing after action. And in fact, I'm in discussions about planning for a second wave. So it's been extremely busy last few months, and I'm just catching up myself this week, so which is quite nice to talk to you.
Yeah, I'm just curious here. I'm throwing in a new question here, but did you do any pandemic planning before in all your work, say in Wales, UK, or anywhere else?
I did, in fact, yes. I had quite a few different roles in my old career in the UK, and it was all about people, communities, and the environment eventually, and public health was one of them. And in fact, I assisted with logistical preparedness and planning for H1N1, the flu pandemic, and SARS outbreak, as well as zoonotic diseases as well. So it's quite a varied career back behind 25 years.
Right. Because I know that there are perhaps some emergency managers worldwide who hadn't really been affected by pandemics, but here's their chance. So I'm just wondering, how did you get into this field?
Yeah, it's quite a long story, I suppose, so I'm trying to give you a few words about it. I started in a federal equivalent government department, and I suppose it would be compared to Ministry of Environment, EMBC, Flynn Road, Mines, and Public Safety Canada, perhaps a few others. So it's quite a large government department, and I started in 1995. And over the years, I sort of specialized in incident management and got promoted. And I find that working in the incidents has kept me in this field, really, because I started dealing with, people, public health, a lot of environmental incidents, but then also industry, commerce, as well as, the impact to the environment as a whole.
Right. Now, I know some people, like, partway through, they just give up. They're like, I don't know, some people might get PTSD or whatever. They just say they want something a little bit more relaxing. So I'm just wondering, what kept you in this field for so many years?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and unfortunately, I've been in the wrong place at the right time to manage incidents, including loss of life. And I think there's something within you. The vocation is sort of deeper down. I think it's around about 1996. I became a senior officer in my federal government, and I specialized in incident management, and that opened the world up to multi-agency work. So it was a lot of dealing with the police, the military, the fire services, and all the different types of responders to bring them together, because we went through, in the UK, the modernization of emergency management in 2004. So that was part of my role to embed that legislation. And in fact, later on in my career, I actually wrote policy legislation. So it's I think it's been a foundation there to be involved in incident management in some speak. I very much enjoy it. I've always wanted to help people, and my wife is actually in a caring profession, whereas I see emergency management as a different type of caring profession to look at the larger picture. So
right.
So it's been quite an interesting career.
Yeah, actually, last week I talked to a professor from Coventry University in Coventry, UK, and she is Dr. Let me see, I get her name, Dr. Basbu Erkan. She's originally from Turkey, and she told me when they're getting in students into their master's or bachelor of disaster management, they interview them, and then one of the best answers she likes is when asked, "Why are you going into this field?" They answer, we want to help people. So she says she really likes that answer. So you hit the nail on the head there, I guess. So I just a quick question. There's so much vocabulary in emergency management. So I wonder exactly what is incident management that you've been talking about?
Oh, yeah. So that's definitely a UK hang on.
Okay.
Yeah, the last 3 years has been very interesting for me, from my perspective here in Canada and BC, because my terminology is slightly different to the Canadian version. So when I talk about incident management, I am talking about emergency management. They are interchangeable. In the UK, it was seen as very interchangeable. We used more incident management because it was very focused on the incident and the structures around it. So we embedded ICS procedures, but we also embed gold, silver, bronze procedures as well, which is maybe coming into BC. So I heard from JIBC the other day.
Okay, and just for our international listeners here, JIBC is Justice Institute of British Columbia, which is the province on the westmost part of Canada, and that's where I studied for 2 years, and I donated $20,000 to their education. I'm just joking. I spent 20 grand on their education, hoping it pays off over the next 10 years. But so it's called incident management. So I'm supposing that UK has a totally different framework. And BC, I talked to somebody who's working for Emergency Management BC who told me that compared to other countries, we might be a little bit behind. So hopefully we'll be catching up, right?
Yeah. And it was one of the things when I came across in 1997 and then started in 98 in BC. It was getting the terminology right. And I remember speaking to some senior people in Emergency Management BC saying, you can't say that. We haven't got a project for that. You can't use those words. And I would just change my words and they would say, yes, we can support you. And it was quite an interesting experience from my perspective because terminology and buzzwords do mean the same things. They can be interchangeable. Obviously, there are specific words that you need to use, from an engineering background as well. So it's a very interesting time for me coming in and learning new terminology and, in fact, learning new policies.
Right. So I'm wondering, what's your current role?
So, my current role is I'm the principal and founder of Red Dragon Consulting. I offer all types of emergency, and I'll use emergency management, as you can tell, and resilience services, ranging from risk assessments to emergency plans to, in fact, wildfire communications, training, exercising. And I'm using my sector background to base those on because obviously I was involved as a federal government. I went in and I was a government decision maker on many occasions. Liaison, emergency operations center directors, as well as dealing with major industrial incidents and maritime incidents, including up to counterterrorism. So I'm using my wealth of experience to try and help people write plans and embed them in their organizations.
Okay. Now, I'm not trying to be repetitive here, but I'm wondering about your background in Wales, United Kingdom. What are some other ways that it has specifically prepared you for this role right now where you're in, I guess we'd call it Okanagan region of southwest British Columbia, Canada?
Yeah, certainly. And in fact, my operating area is slightly wider than BC at the moment. So my background has certainly helped me. I think, first of all, I certainly respect the First Nations whose land I'm living and working in. And I'm finding the Welsh connection is very interesting, from the Welsh culture, more based on the environment and trying to understand the environment around you. There are linkages within the First Nations. So I'm finding that very, very interesting, especially speaking to some of the knowledge keepers within the Okanagan and, in fact, further away. So that's definitely a huge learning point for me. And I find my background has certainly helped me get there because I started as a technician and then worked my way up to senior officer and inspector and then higher up into specific roles for emergency management. And part of my career was actually 15 years of enforcement. So when I turned up onto a site, whether it's a oil refinery or it's a farm or whether it's a huge wastewater treatment works or a power station, I had an enforcement role as well. So whereas sometimes I would be there for emergency management, directing staff, dealing with the issue and the consequences, on other times I would be the team that led the enforcement. So you really need to deal with people in the right way from the start, depending on the circumstance. And there is so much that you can learn from people when you start speaking to them. my philosophy is nobody ever knows everything. I've met some very, very intelligent people of my time, especially in the nuclear sector, and you can learn so much from anybody. It doesn't matter if they haven't got shoes on. So it's certainly one of the things that I pride myself in, trying to talk to people wherever they are in BC or Western Canada.
Right. Now, you're talking about enforcement, and in my mind, I get an image of the police. So is that kind of like you go to critical infrastructure, like whatever, an energy power plant or something, and you make sure that they keep the safety rules so that, I mean, you could call this preventative medicine, preventative procedure so that a disaster doesn't happen. You're kind of like stopping a potential disaster in a way.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because the UK legislation allowed somebody like myself in my past career to take steps for a potential emergency. So whereas we see in BC at the moment, it's all about the reaction. Obviously, there's a preparedness element that is out there for governments and First Nations and all the organizations. But the legislation within the UK was all about preventing something, the potential. And we would actually manage the response on the potential. So whether it's even a food chain contamination or, using your example, a power station breach, we would look at the potential and the consequences of that.
Like I have a friend who works in occupational health and safety, so I know that, it's not occupational. She's, I guess, an inspector for different kinds of organizations, make sure there's worker safety there. But you're not necessarily looking at worker safety. You're more looking at, say, if chemicals leak out of a plant into the community. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. It's definitely, the chemical contamination would be one example. The power station or oil refinery explosion. We look at the investigation and the enforcement regarding that to see whether safety protocols and environmental legislation was broken. But also we had the difficult job of looking at the consequences from any type of incident to public health. And we would be the organization that would alert the health practitioners to get them to be organized. So even if it was zoonotic or an outbreak, we would be looking at how that we could help them control that outbreak. So it was a lot of in-depth knowledge required of many different facets of the working world.
Okay. Now, Paul, I know you have responsibility for all of British Columbia in your role now, but you're in an area called Okanagan, which is close to my heart because my grandmother's father was an immigrant from Denmark to the Okanagan. So I've got like a long background there, and I love that place. I love Penticton, Kelowna, Naramata, Summerland, all these little places, and I think I might have even been through Okanagan Falls, but I love that place. Now, I'm wondering what's happening there for emergency management these past few months and years, because even though I haven't been there since my grandparents passed away, I seen that, wow, so many like floods and so many wildfires. It's just like things are kind of like ramping up there.
Yeah, it was certainly a baptism for me to be coming into the Okanagan. I am very privileged to call Okanagan my home. And in fact, it was a dartboard moment of where do we want to live, which is quite interesting at my time of life with my family. So I was very lucky to be offered a job, first of all, in the regional district, Okanagan Similkameen. Early 2018, and I think maybe it was 6 weeks, I think actually less, that we had our first flood. I think, if I can recall it in my head, I think it was late March the 22nd, in fact, 2018. And I remember that day because we took keys of our new house that we decided to buy and create a home in, and we flooded. So it was the same day that my house flooded with about 3 inches of water in the lower floor. No real damage, so to speak, because we'd just literally had the keys that day. And I was dealing with people flooding out south of Penticton because of the creek had risen so quickly because of the rainfall, the very heavy rainfall, and onto the snowpack. they were, experiencing, 1 to 2 feet of water rushing through their house. So, in fact, I remember being completely wet after trying to dig a ditch with whatever I could find to try and move the water away from my house. And by the time I come off the first phone calls from residents who were obviously concerned and, of course, angry because of the flood, I was completely dry. So,
wow.
Yeah, so I think I then went on to 155 days of activation of EOC. And in fact, in the first month, I moved the Emergency Operations Centre around about 4 times. And the regional district, Okanagan Similkameen, have actually got a dedicated room now for emergency operations. And I remember asking on my first day, where is what I call the incident room, the EOC? Oh, okay. We haven't got one. So when I left, after 155 days of activation, they had a dedicated room. And I think, if I'm recalling, we went on to have 11 major landslides and 40,000 hectares of wildfire.
Wow.
It was during this time, I had around over 400 staff working on the EOC, just because it was such a widespread event. So we had obviously contractors out on sites, tiger dams, gabion baskets, the HESCO bins, and I sent out around about 1.2 million sandbags. Not me personally, because I had an amazing, wonderful team. So I really dropped into Okanagan with a bang, I suppose, unfortunately, because 2017, it was a major Okanagan lake flood. And of course, a lake flood is very slow. You can see it coming. Depending on the weather, of course, so you don't have wave action, but you can actually see the event unfolding in front of you and you can take steps. Whereas ephemeral flooding, when it appears all over the place in the dry creeks, 30 or 40 places, and then ramps up to horrendous torrents coming down on houses, which are, in my eyes, built in the wrong place. You tend to have quite widespread, difficult emergency management issues. So it was certainly, landing in, I think actually some days I walked out of the EUC and I went, oh, the sun's shining. So it was certainly an amazing start to my career. I worked with some amazing people, and it was during that time the province actually saw my knowledge. And later on I went to work for Regional District Kootenay Boundary in Grand Forks to look after their flood that affected them in 2018. So that was really the start of my career as a consultant within BC, because before I was thinking I'm going to come into government and deal with different things, and where do I go? It's a new country. How do I learn? But I certainly learned my learning curve was vertical for the first month or so. So
it seems a bit ironic because your area, like all those areas of Grand Forks, and if people are listening internationally, go to your search engine and check out these places: Okanagan, Grand Forks, Penticton, Kelowna. But these places are supposed to be for relaxing, and people retire there. And then it sounds like you just got there, and all of a sudden, this is no place for relaxing or retiring. This is like moving into a war zone. So it's like, as you said, baptism of fire.
Yeah, I remember my family sending me pictures. They were enjoying themselves on a patio somewhere having a meal and sending me pictures, and I'm still in the EOC. So it was certainly an eye opener. And the last few years I've just met so many people within the Okanagan Valley. You mentioned Kelowna and Vernon, right up into Kamloops. I'm working up further north now as well. So it's been a real eye opener for me, and part of it, and this is one of the reasons I moved to Canada, is to relearn things. And I certainly managed that in the first 6 months of my role here, so which is really good.
Wow, that is amazing. Now I'm wondering, when you sleep at night and you've got recurring dreams and maybe some really special, real situation, not fantasy, a real incident that happened to you in your past, it kind of comes to your dreams and, I don't know, either makes you feel proud or haunts you. But what are a couple of situations that really stand out for you in your career?
Yeah, that's a big question from my perspective, because there's some things I can share and some things I cannot share on this podcast.
Of course,
I've been involved in some major events which have really looked at the social interactions and the human interactions of that event. So, and obviously those have shaped me, as well as all the emergency responders that do on the front line. So, I've been there and dealt with that. But I think the first major incident that I dealt with, I had 12 months experience. I was a technician at the time, and it was the Sea Empress, a marine oil tanker, hit the rocks just down the road from where I lived, February the 15th, 1996, because it's a day before my birthday.
Wow.
And spilled 110,000 tons of crude oil. So I was a technician at the time. I was doing routine inspections, and then I got deployed to assist in the monitoring stages of where all that oil was going on the land, on the beaches, the estuaries, out to sea. So it was a very, very interesting time for me to see this huge machine roll up, an EOC, Emergency Operations Center. They do call it something else in the UK, but there was hundreds of people there. And I was just wondering what glues all this together, because there was teams of people working in the Port Authority at the time. They were taking over 3 or 4 floors, 400 or 500 people. There were salvage cells. There was police cells, there was site operations, there was cleanup operations, there was waste management, and there was crowd volunteer control, there was team organizing volunteers just for the cleanup of seabirds. So I was wondering what on earth was holding this all together. So that was 12 months into my career. That was the largest incident. And I suppose if you fast forward just a few years, because in 12 months later from that, I became a senior officer because I got promoted and done my exams. And I went on to be the national foot and mouth site manager for a military site for 10 months, where the UK went into agricultural lockdown. We're in COVID days now, but went into an agricultural lockdown for foot and mouth crisis in 2001. And I was stationed on a military site for 10 months dealing with animal products. Perhaps I won't go into any more detail, but it was a very interesting and trying and challenging time to be stationed there and dealing with those sites. So it's I definitely learned a lot, and I had quite a few mentors. I'm not going to share the name because they're senior in the military, and I worked with ex-paratroopers, colonels, and majors in dealing with that situation. So I think, they really stand out for me for some of the things, and you can move on in my career. I've done a lot with the Her Majesty's Coast Guard because I was really interested in the marine side of it. And in fact, in 2002, I was deployed to Spain for the Prestige incident, where 70,000 tons of crude oil had spilt. So I went as an audit role I remember the senior scientist of the Coast Guard saying, you should be there for 3 or 4 days. I ended up being there for nearly 4 weeks. I ended up training the Spanish Coast Guard, which again was a wonderful experience because thrown into a different country, a different language. I had to translate it, thank goodness, because my Spanish is very poor. Dealing with how to do things and what to do and set up priorities and consequences. So I was northern Spain, around about Santander area, putting large oil booms out on protecting different aquaculture sites. So I've walked around major sites with Geiger counters in my hand, looking for rogue sources. I've been assisted in Goal Command, so that's Strategic Incident Command, where the equivalent, it's a government operations center, is staffed by the Chief Constable, where I've got a member of senior police staff assisting me in my duties. So there's a few things that really stand out, and I suppose I was quite humbled in 2012 to being decorated for my emergency management service. And I was standing in a room with 3 other individuals after being decorated, and all the other staff have got 30 years plus experience, and there's me with less than 20 years, and that was quite humbling for me, to be decorated, with a Queen's Medal to ensure that my recognition was seen. So that was that was definitely humbling for me, and I think that was one of the experiences that really stand out.
I think one day you're going to have to, whenever you slow down, you're going to have to either write a book or make a documentary or do a season of podcast stories, or I don't know. You got a lot to share there. So, now, the other thing, too, is that I think most people, including me, haven't been in the midst of these disasters. And then, the only exposure we get is like on our cell phones, looking at the whatever Guardian or BBC or CBC News, or watching a Netflix disaster movie or something. Like, it's kind of like, just like whatever, Hollywood, something not real. But you are like actually in real situations, seeing it. And there's like no director behind the scenes saying, we're going to, make this thing turn sour or get better. But this is like unpredictable. It could just go in any direction, and there you are trying to manage it. Anyway, I think it's quite amazing. Most people, I don't think, really get it. But
it's certainly not like a movie.
There's no director.
There is no director. Yeah,
you're the director, sort of.
Yeah, sometimes you're the director, and it's not like the movies.
Yeah. So I'm wondering about climate change, because I know in the emergency management industry, it's kind of having a tough time, at least in our neighbor to the south, United States of America. That big elephant that is beside us, little mouse here of Canada. And I know that politically climate change has become a hot potato, and it's like, let's not talk about it, because and then in other parts of the world, especially where you're from, Paul, Europe, it's a big deal. And they're talking about how this is affecting the current weather, because climate, of course, is 30 years of weather records, at least. And it's a big deal in making disasters happen either more frequently or to a greater magnitude. So I'm just wondering, like, in your opinion, how has climate change played a role in disasters?
Oh, yeah, they've certainly played a large role, a significant role across the world. And I remember, because the federal government agency I was in was also the flood agency. So, we were there to manage the floods. We had actually climate change teams looking at adaptation, from carbon emissions right through to flooding levels. So there was, quite a few scientists involved in that. And I remember talking to one of the scientists, and they were saying they were doing a statistical analysis from 1998 to present day. And this was 2015, before I left the UK. They were seeing a shift. So when people talk about 1 in 100 year, 1 in 200 year events, they saw a shift in statistical analysis that we are experiencing more extreme weather, which means those events will happen with more probability. So whereas an event would happen in chance then, in 1 in 100 years, it doesn't mean it only will happen in 1 in 100. We might see those in 1 in 20, 1 in 50 years. So when you look at an area like Grand Forks, the lower part of British Columbia, mm-hmm. They've experienced 3 major floods now in the last 4 years. And this is what UK's always had a flooding issue because of the settlements, the amount of development, the river or the lakes are the places to go, the coastline. And the climate changes has affected them over the last 150, 200 years. So, and you look at Norway, Netherlands, Amsterdam, built below sea level currently. Climate change is a very big factor for them to understand. And when we talk about how much do we need to prepare for a flood, a simple flood, what is the freeboard? What is the amount of space required if you're going to build a house? And so the climate change factors were in place in the UK, and in BC they use flood construction levels. And in fact, in the Okanagan, there's a wonderful project just been shared with the public through the Okanagan Basin Water Board, all about flooding and all the maps available, so you can actually look at the whole of the valley and see where your house is, and then look at the climate or the potential change of that lake level or that river. So this is where the UK was, because we are going to experience extreme weather as we move forward. Not to say the next 5 years could be perfect, not to say the next 10 years could be perfect, but then we're going to get this one rogue year where all the weather hits us. And in fact, we've just recently seen this, because in fact, Finn, we had actually scheduled a call, and I got called away down to Grand Forks because they were experiencing the 2020 flood. The major storms that came through the Kootenays, they had widespread debris and flooding damage right up through to Revelstoke. So these types of storm events are becoming more common. So people need to be more aware of it. It's expected that summer precipitation will likely decrease as we move forward into the future, but the winter precipitation will increase. So, and then the snow melt, we put the snow melt factors on. When will it actually melt and cause freshet? Freshet is the term of, all the snow melting. It can be done in a gradual way, depending on the weather, or if the heavens open and there's rain on snow, it can decide to come down very quickly, or if the temperature changes. And you're talking about the Okanagan and Penticton, we've seen that now, the last month, where temperatures have spiked, causing snowmelt. So all this different weather impacts the climate around us. The wildfires in California, the drought statuses. It's around the world. And I think climate change needs to be brought into emergency management and to understand that risk.
So, Paul, as far as I know, climate change adaptation professionals, it's kind of a loose field. It's interdisciplinary. There's been like scientists and engineers, city planners, maybe health experts. But I haven't seen emergency management professionals so much involved these last, say, 5 years as maybe it could be. So I'm wondering how that climate change adaptation professionals and emergency management professionals, how there can be maybe in your mind more collaboration.
Yeah, certainly. And I think I'm going to use my past experience where those like-minded individuals were part of a risk assessment process. And that risk assessment process actually started at the national level. So they went through all the different scenarios and actually done the equivalent to a hazard risk vulnerability assessment, as well as some mitigation plans for climate change. And that helped the regional governments, the provinces, if I use those terms, understand the need to plan for the future. So they had a risk assessment, which gave them the control measures, right through to land use. So when you actually apply those risk assessments down into the lower levels of government, the local authorities and First Nations and health organizations and industry, it gives a foundation really to understand what is the expected risk of climate change and what needs to adapt. So there definitely needs to be a much more coordinated approach to that risk and understanding of climate change adaptation.
Okay. And it sounds like that, like you're talking about more floods and wildfires and landslides. It sounds like what needs to happen where we live and worldwide is that emergency management, they need to basically double or triple their staffing. Like they have to have more hands on deck to be able to handle all this stuff. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm certainly working for a range of organizations out there. Some people work, on the side of their desks. Emergency management is there in that little pile of paper, right through to having one or two individuals dedicated to it. It depends on the boards and the councils and the organizational will to put an emergency program coordinator or emergency management person in place. My background is there was always a single point of contact within an organization for emergency management. And that only came about because of the legislation. I talked about that modernization of legislation back in 2004. So, there's a chance for BC and Canada to look at different approaches. There's many different approaches. I'm not just talking about UK and Europe. Australia, New Zealand, and FEMA, and in fact Canada, if I could blend all the different parts of emergency management together, they would be an amazing model. So when you say about there's a chance perhaps we need more staff, we definitely need more thought and resources to try and deal with the emergency, whether it's at preparedness, response, or at the recovery stages. We see it with BC wildfire. They do an amazing job fighting fires, but they've also gone into assisting with flood defence, which impacts their training. So the province and all the governments need to look at how best to shape this. And I think that's something that hopefully will come in through the future now with the modernisation of emergency management in BC.
Right. Now, the thing too is that this all costs money, and going through COVID-19, it seems to, have put a big dent in our economy. So hopefully in the next 5-10 years that the way we tax people and corporations, etc., there'll be the money to put into, well, I guess we have no choice, right? But we have to be able to find the money to do all of this, right? So
yeah, I think that's a very good point, Vin, because at the moment most governments are trying to find the money to deal with it. There's a model really. If you spend $1 compared to the 7 in mitigation compared to response, by mitigating issues in the long run is cheaper, but you need to spend the money up front. And of course, COVID-19 has really shaken the world of how a pandemic can impact all the economy and all the services from local to regional to provincial to right across Canada. So it's going to be a very different landscape over the next 12 months, maybe 2 years following COVID. But to put in place these differences to emergency management, we're talking about 5 years into the future, 8 years into the future, because there has to be a gradual evolutionary change rather than just change for change's sake.
Right. Now, you've already alluded to kind of your ideal for British Columbia, your vision for future improvements in emergency management. So I'm wondering if you could maybe flesh that out a little bit. And then also, what's your vision for your own career in business?
Right. Okay. I definitely think there's an opportunity for BC. And speaking to some of the policymakers 12 months ago, they had looked at different models across the world, including the UK, which was really good. When you go and write policy, and I've been in this situation in 2012, 2015, writing policy that affects so many different elements of governments and people and communities, you really need to take a step back to understand all the impacts of that policy. So it's really good to hear that they've gone out to look at other models. But if they can put in place a framework to provide a foundation for, I would say, more strategic emergency management. You talked about using the resources efficiently, because there's some big provincial organizations. We don't want to work in silos. We want to work together. And I think there's a chance for the modernization to bring people together to assess those risks and actually inform the emergency planning priorities so that we can actually put in place emergency plans, ranging from business continuity plans, because that seems to be a new topic in British Columbia at the moment. These are the plans that continues the business. You don't want to be reactive to when an event happens, whether it's COVID, whether it's the loss of your IT system or loss of a payroll system. Let's be honest, impacting people. Now's not the time to go and put a business continuity in place when you're at the coalface. And I think it's definitely about public education. Was one of my eye-openers when I came into BC, how the public don't necessarily see the risk around them. I was the first time within the Okanagan, traveling down through, I was in awe of the landscape. Wales have got some amazing, beautiful places, but BC's Wales on steroids, if I use that term correctly. But people don't see the risk where they build, where they live. And I think you can work in partnership with the environment. So I think there's a whole need for public education to make sure people are aware. And then that warning aspect of the potential emergency that may happen and what they need to do. So that's a whole piece of work really that needs to be embedded in the future of BC.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also the local responders working together, because the first time you meet a local responder shouldn't be in an EOC environment. It should be in a planning environment where you can create a relationship with that person to ensure your plans are dovetailed into their plans. So rather than the reactive part, we need to spend some effort in the preparing. And don't get me wrong, there's some amazing examples of preparedness out there. And I think it boils down to the funding. And as you mentioned, the capacity of the limited amount of emergency management staff within the different governments. So I think there's definitely a chance to come together under the new modernisation of emergency management. Regional forums to share best practice, to share plans, risk assessments, and to share those procedures so people know that when they get the call, they know exactly what to do, rather than having multiple emergency operations centres doing the same thing. We can be a lot more efficient with that. And I think the modernisation of emergency management will help that, and it'll help give structure to the different organisations, because there's a lot of differences out there of how people do things. The spirit of the Act is not something I wish to hear, really. It's when you get a legislation and a regulation, it's very clear then what the organisational government department need to put in place. So then they can actually respond correctly. And in defining somebody's role is very helpful.
Okay. Now, Red Dragon Consulting, that's the name of your company. So how do you see yourself fitting into all this future scenario?
That's easy. I want to make a difference. I've come to BC, to Canada, to really make a difference. It's one of I've got to say, is a highlight in my career. I've done some wonderful things in the past, but dealing with people as a consultant, trying to create teams, trying to embed knowledge and methodologies in different organizations. That's what I really want to do, because every project I undertake, I really want to embed into that team. And, this world of virtual reality is very interesting for me, because I don't mind dealing with Skypes and Zooms and Microsoft and all the rest of the stuff. But sometimes having that 1-to-1 and 1-to-8 interaction for a project is ideal, because you learn so much more from the client, in my perspective, the team around you, to try and help them through it. So if I can mentor and help people, I'll be satisfied. Okay,
wow, that's wonderful. Now, I went to Justice Institute of British Columbia in New Westminster for 5 semesters. And I saw that I won't say hundreds, I don't know the number, but there are a lot of people right now studying to get into emergency management. I don't know what's their motivation, but yeah, a lot of people. So I'm wondering what kind of skills, what kind of education, and perhaps volunteer work, or I don't know, networking, strategic action would people need to get into this field?
Yeah, it's academia is a wonderful starting point for a foundation within emergency management. I started through environmental protection to understand all the processes behind it, and then morphed into emergency management. You hit the nail there. Experience is the catch-22. People coming out of college and university and such like really need experience to understand how they apply that academic knowledge into the professional workplace. So you need practitioner competence in order to deal with emergencies. You cannot just go on the course and understand the forms that need to be filled in and sent to X, Y, and Z. It's not just about the organizational charts. It's all about the process behind it, because you can be the one person in the room managing the incident, or you can have 100 people helping you manage the incident, or you can be part of that team. So experience is really where people coming out of university need to look at volunteer projects, whether it's even through search and rescue, because they've got such a good skill base and training, or even emergency support services, definitely on the people side of things there. But it's trying to get involved in different projects. Climate resilience is one of them, but it's certainly a very hard area for people to work in, because people come out of university with the grand aspiration of being an emergency manager. I've been in this field for 25 years and I'm still learning. So you need to start small and do things well. Going into emergency management technician roles and assistant roles and maybe coordinator roles with the support around you is certainly very advantageous. But for people who really, they need to map out the first 5 or 6 years of their career and get experience, whether it's in industry or in forestry or in different organizations. It's going to help the emergency management competence in the end. So sometimes the road is not straight. Sometimes it's a very mountainous road, so to speak.
Right. Well, I know everybody has their own path. Now, Paul, I'm just wondering, do you have any last minute message for the audience?
Yeah. Well, certainly. Thank you very much for listening. And I think going back on one point there, for people to realize that it takes training and competence to be an emergency manager, but also personal skills. Some days you're a facilitator, some days you're helping people through a very, very emotional subject. So look at training, competence, and personal skills in that, using your words, zigzag of a career. You learn every day from everybody around you, whether it's dealing with the people, dealing with the community, or the environment as a whole. So I'm going to end with one of my catchphrases: every day is a school day.
Exactly. That's great. Yeah. Once we get older, sometimes we're like, I've learned everything and I don't need to learn anymore. But that's the exact attitude. I really appreciate it. So thank you so much, Paul, for taking time out of your busy schedule for the next flood or the next wildfire. And I hope you have a great week and weekend and the upcoming month of July.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Vin, for inviting us. And I'm glad we could finally get together and go through your questions.
Okay,
thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, then. Take care. There we have it, folks. That's my interview with emergency management specialist Paul Edmonds. Thank you again, Paul, for being a guest here at the Multi-Hazards podcast. So, as I do in every episode, I will give a little disclaimer. A little disclaimer here I added to the end of each and every episode these days, and it is: this podcast is meant to be educational and does not try to offer legal, medical, or other specific advice unless otherwise noted. Also, the opinions expressed here do not necessarily reflect those of the organizations that the host, that's me, or guests are part of. And so, here as I finish this episode, I thank all of you dear listeners for taking the time to listen. Stay safe out there and stay tuned for more. This is Vin Nelson wishing you the best on your journey of surviving and thriving with all that life throws at you. Cheers to you all. Peace out.